I've always wondered to myself why so few of the people in my life identify as feminists, especially since they all believe unequivocally in equal rights. This disparity between equalists and feminists has been researched before. A poll by HuffPost and YouGov in 2013 investigated the gulf between those who believe in equal rights and those who call themselves feminists. They found that only 20% of Americans identify as feminists, but 82% of those surveyed responded that they believe in equality between men and women, which is an inherently feminist statement. As a feminist myself, I wanted to know what exactly about feminism pushed that 62% away from the ideology, with an aim to help feminism as a movement avoid these issues in the future. I began my investigation by looking into the origin of the concept of intersectionality, with a seminal text called Mapping the Margins by Kimberly Crenshaw. To understand the significance of this text, I first need to define some key terms. Oxford Languages defines feminism as the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. While this is not an incorrect definition, my study regarded feminism from a modern intersectional perspective, meaning that a more accurate definition of feminism is actually that of intersectional feminism. Now, intersectionality itself is defined as the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, which creates overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Thus, when we combine these two terms, we get intersectional feminism, which is the concept that when we discuss gender inequality, each woman will experience different discriminations based on the specifics of her identity. Basically, my experience of gender oppression will be vastly different than that of a Black trans woman, which is an important disparity to recognize in our concept of feminism. Crenshaw is the creator of this concept, and in this text, she introduces and explains the concept of intersectionality as a whole. I then looked into another scholarly article, Intersectionality Undone, by Sirma Bilge, which discusses the limitations of intersectionality and defines how it should be correctly used in a scholarly context. These papers were foundational to my understanding of feminism as a whole, and its usefulness in different contexts. Although papers like that of Bilge and Crenshaw have discussed and explored the roles of feminists in society and the impact of intersectional ideology in different environments, none have discussed the negative attitude held by the public towards feminism in general, even though it seems to be a positive movement, and why this attitude exists. As another way to gauge public perception of feminism, I read content which inspired anti-feminist rhetoric, such as the Scum Manifesto by Valerie Solanas, Has Feminism Veered Off Track by Caroline Overington, and a series of anti-feminist Reddit threads and comment sections. The field of research I explored was so uninvestigated that I decided to focus on amassing background knowledge on the issues facing feminism today, because no other study had begun to discuss these issues. These sources informed me on current anti-feminist rhetoric, which gave me an understanding of where to focus the questions in my survey. In my search for a survey on public perception of feminism, I found the aforementioned poll by HuffPost and YouGov, comparing the percentages of people who believed in equal rights with those who call themselves feminists. This study informed me on the gulf I was searching for between feminists and equalists, but offered no explanation of why this rift exists. It was in this research that I realized that although there is a wealth of feminist information, there's never before been a study that synthesized what we already know about feminism with what the public thinks of feminism. Conclusions by HuffPost have only hinted at the potential reasons why such a gulf exists between feminists and equalists. Thus, an investigative survey is greatly needed in the literature to provide context for the factors detracting from the use of feminist as a label and assess the public's understanding of modern feminism in general. This evident gap, my foundational texts, and my curiosities led me to the following research question. What factors undermine feminism as a movement and lead to reluctance around individuals self-identifying as feminists? Based on my readings, I hypothesized that most people were deterred from feminism as an ideology because of confusion around modern feminism, the gendered etymology of the word, and anti-feminist rhetoric. Let me define these terms. By confusion around modern feminism, I mean that people aren't comfortable supporting a movement they don't understand. If individuals don't have a comprehensive understanding of feminism, past and present, they are less likely to support it. When I use the phrase gendered etymology, I'm referring to how feminism contains the Latin root femina, which means relating to women. I hypothesize that people who aren't female might feel uncomfortable using a female-rooted word, as they feel it doesn't apply to them. Finally, by anti-feminist rhetoric, I mean the sexist words and actions we see against feminism on all fronts, and I'm investigating how these messages affect people's feelings towards feminism in general. Next, I assessed my method, Consulting Gender and Corporate Social Responsibility, the Moderating Role of Feminism by S. Shafiq and N. Tabassum. They employed the use of a mixed method mail and interview survey where both qualitative and quantitative methods of data analysis were used. In this study, researchers looked into individuals' perceptions of how feminism impacted their corporate work lives. This paper was the closest to what I planned to do, in that it investigated one facet of the public's perception of feminism. So I decided to model my own research on this study and include the paper as a jumping-off point. Using the study as a reference, I decided that for a topic as complex and politically loaded as feminism, a mixed method survey would need to be implemented to give respondents opportunities to explain themselves and elaborate on their opinions, and create a broader picture than raw data alone. This would give me both percentage answers on clearer black and white topics, as well as broader responses to more complex topics. And it would allow me to ask those long answer questions without being inundated with excess data. My survey was distributed via email at a private high school in Victoria, BC, and via me and my mother's personal social media on Instagram and Facebook. One limitation of this distribution method was the voluntary nature of participation in my study, which skewed the demographics of my respondents, as those with an interest in feminism were far more likely to answer my survey. Now, onto my findings and discussion. Firstly, I want to compare the results I found on how many individuals in my population call themselves feminists versus how many believe in equal rights, as was done in the study by HuffPost and YouGov. In my survey, 82% of respondents self-identified as feminists, and 99% believe in equal rights. Between these two numbers is a 17% gap, which represents the respondents who believe in an inherently feminist statement about equality, but don't call themselves feminists. In order to examine what is keeping individuals from calling themselves feminists, I focused on the unique attributes and respondents of the 31 individuals who have been kept, by one factor or another, from supporting feminism. I began by exploring my hypothesized factors: confusion around modern feminism, gendered etymology of the word, and anti-feminist rhetoric. For confusion around feminism, I asked respondents about their knowledge of different waves of feminism in the past, and intersectionality, which is a modern feminist concept. For reference in the graphs, the feminist population of respondents will always be shown on the left, and the non-feminists on the right. As you can see here, 50% of feminist respondents reported a solid understanding of the waves of feminism, as compared with only 32% of non-feminist respondents. Similarly, 56% of feminist respondents had heard of intersectionality, as compared with 29% of non-feminist respondents. Clearly, feminists had a better understanding of feminism, past and present, than non-feminists, which isn't exactly surprising. Although the responses to this question might seem obvious, the data collected hints at the idea that education on feminism is a key component of self-identification. Unfortunately, the questions in my survey were not specific enough to determine that a lack of feminist education caused people to not identify as feminists. While there's certainly something to be said about the importance of education in order to increase support for feminism, this data offered no conclusions about what was leading people away from feminism in the first place. Next, I discussed gendered etymology. The word feminist is surrounded in negative connotations, and more neutral alternative labels could be attractive to those who don't resonate with the word feminist, but wish to demonstrate a belief in equality. In my survey, non-feminist respondents showed clear preference for those less loaded or gendered terms. When asked about the neutral labels equalist, egalitarianist, or humanist, I received the following responses. 47% of non-feminists would call themselves equalists, 39% egalitarianists, and 58% humanists. This data provides extremely compelling evidence that non-feminists are greatly turned off from feminism by the label and its potential connotations, but not the ideology of feminism itself. This idea also aligned with the reasoning in one of my sources, an article from The Guardian titled "Why I'm an Equalist and Not a Feminist" by a prevalent female scientist. Although this data is a clear indicator of support for neutral labels, upon reflection, my questions are again not quite specific enough to determine whether the support for those labels is because of their neutral etymology. From this data, I can't tell whether respondents don't like the connotations of the word feminism or the feminine word itself. However, although there's a lack of evidence on gendered etymology specifically, gender most certainly plays a role in support for feminism. In my survey, 68% of non-feminist respondents were men, and they would be the target population for a non-feminized feminist label. So although it can't be confirmed that individuals liked these neutral terms for their non-gendered etymology, gender most certainly plays a role. Finally, I looked into the impact of anti-feminist rhetoric on support for feminism. When asked about seeing anti-feminist jokes in the media, 85% of feminists said they had seen such content, as compared with 77% of non-feminists. When asked about misrepresentation of feminism in the media, 79% of feminists reported to have seen such content, as compared with 71% of non-feminists. This data might seem a bit backwards, but the fact that feminists seem to see more anti-feminist content than non-feminists may have to do with the fact that they would be more sensitive to it. After analyzing this data and coming up with somewhat confusing results, I turned to other potential sources of anti-feminist rhetoric, namely the opinions of friends and family on feminism, and I was met with much more compelling results. When asked about the attitudes of parents towards feminism, 47% of feminists said their parents self-identified as feminists too, as compared with a measly 16% in non-feminists. Similarly, 62% of feminists said their friends were feminists too, as compared with 13% in non-feminists. This data suggested a phenomenon I hadn't previously considered, that feminist identification relied heavily on the attitudes of parents and friends. Thus, it seems that the most powerful anti-feminist rhetoric, the kind that causes individuals to not support the label or movement, does not come from the media, but instead from our loved ones. Before I announce my conclusion, I would like to remind you that my question was as follows. What factors undermine feminism as a movement and lead to reluctance around individuals self-identifying as feminists? The conclusions I came to in order to answer this question are relatively simple. First, the main determining factors which kept individuals from identifying as feminists were the opinions of their friends and family, and the negative connotations of the label feminist. Another important conclusion is the idea that a neutral label might increase public interest and engagement in activist movements like feminism. My final conclusion arose from a pattern I noticed in my qualitative data that actually wasn't previously represented in my survey, wherein many non-feminist individuals cited that they disliked certain actions of radical feminists and didn't want to be associated with that variety of feminism. From these conclusions, there are a few key takeaways for feminists and non-feminists alike. First, as identification relies heavily on the opinions of our social circle, time and energy should be invested into broadening those circles and engaging in diverse discourse on different political opinions. Individuals should also assess for themselves where their negative associations with ideologies like feminism arise from, and how best to combat this. Feminists should also be aware of the way that radicalism negatively affects feminism as a whole, and consider changing certain aspects of their approach to activism. This brings me to the potential future research that could stem from my findings in this study. Based on the comments made by respondents in my survey, I think that investigation into the negative effects of radical feminism would yield interesting results. The effect of social and parental influence on general opinions towards social justice would also be a worthy research topic, to see the range of this phenomenon. Another subject that bears investigation is the part that education, or a lack thereof, plays in whether individuals call themselves feminists or not. Finally, as feminism seeks to gain traction with a wider audience, it would be fascinating to see if more of the public would be interested in changing what we call feminism to one of the aforementioned neutral labels. Thank you.